This evening, our distinguished speaker is Robert Schreiter, C.PP.S. And Vatican II Professor of Theology at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. The lecture is entitled Catholicity Between Empire and Solidarity. I'm going to call on my colleague Susan Abraham in a few moments to introduce our speaker this evening. But first, I want to introduce to you the Dudleian lecture. Which is always a pleasure, because I do think one of the marks of memory and continuity in an academic institution is often sort of knowing where traditions come from, and the Dudleian lecture goes back a long way. It's the oldest and most distinguished endowed lecture at Harvard. It was established in 1751 by Paul Dudley, who was born on September 3rd, 1675 in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and he died on January 25th, 1751. So it does go back a ways. After graduating from the Roxbury Latin School, which is the oldest continuously existing school in America, and calls itself the one true school even today, and he went on to Harvard College, where he graduated in 1690. He studied law at the Temple in London and became Attorney General of Massachusetts from 1702 and served in that capacity for 16 years. He was Associate Justice of the Superior Court of Massachusetts from 1718 until 1745, and Chief Justice from 1745 until his death in 1751. So a long record of service to the Commonwealth. He is finally the founder of the Dudleian Lectures on Religion, as I've indicated, at the Divinity School, so we can be grateful to him across the years. Our recent speakers for the Dudleian include Miroslav Volf of Yale in 2005, Susanna Heschel from Dartmouth in 2006, Paul Roram from Princeton in 2008, Pilar Maria Aquino, University of San Diego, 2009, Sally McFay at Vanderbilt, or at least I think she was already emerita at Vanderbilt at that time, in 2010, and Scott Appleby from Notre Dame last year. Tonight, my esteemed colleague, as I said, Susan Abraham, Assistant Professor of Ministry Studies and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, is going to introduce Professor Schreiter. Susan joined the HDS faculty in 2007, and as I look around, most of you know all about Susan, but I will note that her teaching and research does explore post-colonial and feminist theological practices that invigorate contemporary communities of faith. She's the author of Identity, Ethics, and Nonviolence in Post-Colonial Theory, a Rahnerian Theological Assessment, 2007, and co-editor of Shoulder to Shoulder, Frontiers in Catholic Feminist Theology, Fortress, 2009. Her publications and presentations weave practical theological insights from the experience of working as a youth minister for the Diocese of Mumbai in India, with the theoretical perspectives from post-colonial theory and cultural studies, as well as feminist theory that she studies. Ongoing research projects for her include issues in feminist theological education and formation, interfaith and interreligious peace initiatives, theology and political theory, religion and media, global Christianities, and Christianity between colonialism and post-colonialism. And I can say, we were discussing this just before the lecture, that if some of these fields seem to overlap with some of the interest of our speaker tonight, it's little wonder, because Susan, who received a master's degree from Catholic Theological Union, had Professor Schreiter as her teacher and mentor throughout her career there. And we look forward to learning more from her about our speaker, whom she knows better than any of the rest of us, I expect. And we're also, Professor Schreiter, looking forward to the lecture this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Graham, for that very generous introduction. It is a great honor for me to introduce Professor Robert Schreiter to the Harvard Divinity School community. As was already mentioned, Professor Schreiter is Vatican Council II Professor of Theology at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, but has also served as Professor of Theology and Culture at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. Professor Schreiter has taught at CTU since 1974 and served for 9 years as its dean. I remember when I got there in 91, I had only heard of him as a legend, and everybody said he was the youngest dean ever. Apparently, he just became dean right away. He has published 19 books, among which are Constructing Local Theologies, The New Catholicity, Reconciliation, Mission and Ministry in a Changing Social Order, The Ministry of Reconciliation, Spirituality and Strategies, and Mission in the Third Millennium. Additionally, his essays have appeared in over 100 other books, and translations of his work appear in more than 20 languages. He is general editor of the Faith and Culture series for Orbis Books. Among the editorial boards of journals that he is a member, these journals are Concilium, International Journal of Practical Theology, Studies in Interreligious Dialogue, and Theological Studies. He is past president of the American Society of Missiology and of the Catholic Society of America. He has also been involved in social reconciliation work on all 6 continents. He served for 12 years as a consultant for programs in reconciliation for Caritas Internationalis, the umbrella organization for 162 relief and development agencies in the Roman Catholic Church. Through the Catholic Peace Building Network, he is currently involved in a 5-year project for peace building in Mindanao in the southern Philippines with the support of Catholic Relief Services, and is also beginning to work with the Colombian Bishops' Conference in that country. With Scott Appleby and Gerard Powers of the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, he has recently published Catholic Peace-Building Theology, Ethics, and Praxis. Professor Schreiter is a member of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood and was ordained a priest in 1974. I would like to read to you a few words from the dedication to Professor Schreiter when he was awarded the John Courtney Murray Award by the Catholic Theological Society of America in 2005. I quote, "Our recipient this year is a native Midwesterner from the Cornhusker State." Somehow this is exotic in this space. But his vocation and ministry have taken him many thousands of miles away to dozens of countries around the world. The model of an ecclesial theologian, our honoree has dedicated his life to the theological enterprise as a service to the Church and to the demands of Christian discipleship in a pluralistic, though too often divided world, end quote. Professor Schreiter, as always, with the deepest gratitude for your many kindnesses to me over 2 decades of mentoring. I welcome you to HDS on behalf of the students, the staff, and the faculty.
Thank you, Susan, for that very kind introduction. It is a great privilege for me to be with you to deliver this year's Dudleian lecture. The charge for this lecture, given in the original bequest, is a formidable one. Namely, and I quote, "Against the Romish Church, their tyranny, usurpations, damnable heresies, fatal errors, and abominable superstitions." Of course, the climate in ecclesiastical and political relations has changed considerably since 1751, and in our own times, this 3rd lecture in the 4-year cycle is intended to have a different tone. I will be dwelling somewhat in this presentation on the theological, social, and political frontiers along which Roman Catholicism finds itself in the world today, and therefore where tyranny, usurpations, and other evils may well still be found to be lurking. What I wish to do is explore the role of an institution as large and widely spread as is the Roman Catholic Church in a globalized world. Roman Catholicism comprises about 18% of the world's population and roughly half of all Christians, and is found in almost every country in the world. All of this is said not to blow the triumphalist trumpet. It is only to note that given its extension, it inevitably has to think about how it is situated in the world and interacts with the features of that world. To a great extent, life within the Roman Catholic Church mirrors the issues before us in the world as a whole. An increasingly pluralized and urbanized world, the deep ambivalences of the consequences of globalization, a heightened awareness of suffering and conflict, the struggles between the global north and the global south, and the advancing perils of climate change. Within our country, we see a range of challenges and dysfunctional behaviors. Despite modest growth, an exodus of so many people, such that the second largest Christian denomination in the United States would be former Catholics, in the church's treatment of women, the scandals of how sexual abuse by the clergy has been handled, the traumas of parish closings and consolidations, and the dubitable forays of the bishops into national politics. At the same time, one can see places where the church is standing up for human rights and involves itself in peace building. In some countries, such as the newly formed Southern Sudan, it is the civil society that made the referendum on independence possible. It also provides one of the world's largest networks of relief and development work. The question I want to investigate here is how the church, that bears all the marks of the darkest and brightest of human action, sees itself and situates itself as a worldwide organization within the formidable challenges we face today. Its vision of itself and its self-location has to be understood within terms evident to the rest of the world, but must also be true to the church's sense of its own theological identity, if that identity is to serve as a motivation and means of finding its place in the world. The theological category of Catholicity is a way of understanding how the church is a global reality within a globalized world. I first made this claim some 15 years ago without providing more than just a sketch of what that would mean. But I found myself returning to it in the last 5 years or so to work through its implications. Not only what it means in terms of policy toward the world and a theological understanding of its mission, but also to deal with the strains and divisions within the church itself. Increasingly, it seems to help locate the competing visions of the church that are contending with each other about how to live faithfully and prophetically in the contemporary world. The concept of Catholicity is an ancient one in the Christian tradition, and it has often taken on special valence at certain moments throughout the church's history when the identity or meaning of the church itself was at stake, as we'll see shortly. Today, I believe, it provides a way of thinking about Christian faith in the midst of globalization. Indeed, Catholicity and globalization seem to encompass, each in their own sphere, the paradoxes of interconnectedness and distinctiveness, of the global and the local, of inclusion and exclusion that mark the world as we experience it today. At the same time, the attempt at a comprehensive view of the church in a globalized age runs the risk of repeating hegemonic patterns of the past, when the church, both East and West, was deeply implicated in empire by the way it governed, the way it extended itself beyond its borders, and the way it saw its place regarding political power. In this presentation, I want to explore how concepts of Catholicity are shaping the Roman Catholic Church's self-understanding in a globalized world. There are profound issues of identity and also of policy here, and I will suggest that the concept of Catholicity can give coherence and a certain perspective on what is occurring. I am suggesting, therefore, that how Catholicity is at work in the Church's self-understanding today can give us an insight into how a major religious player on the current world stage is seeing itself and what of its internal resources it is calling forth to meet and engage that world. I think this is important far beyond discussions within Christianity or even actually within the religions itself. Within the whole field of international relations, it's clear now that there's a resurgence of religion we have to deal with. And to a great extent, what has appeared in political science and studies of international relations works out of a fairly narrow, secularized view of religion that sees that it should be privatized and sidelined. But that's not the experience of most of the world, and that's not influencing their actions. So these kinds of forays, I believe, are important to help us reset our lenses to better engage the challenges we face in so many parts of the world today. I've really come to this view out of the work I do in peace building in so many countries of the world, where the secular models don't start to match where people actually find themselves. I hope at the same time to signal the dangers that can lead to tyrannies and usurpations that Chief Justice Dudley saw in the Roman Church 2.5 centuries ago. We may smile at his words, but there's some elements of truth still within them. In order to do this, I begin with a brief historical look at how the concept of Catholicity has developed over the course of 2 millennia within Christian theology. This sketch is necessary since contemporary understandings of Catholicity harken back to those earlier discussions. That provides the backdrop for the second part, which looks at two ways in which configurations of Catholicity are at work within Roman Catholicism today, each with the intent of engaging a globalized world, albeit in very different ways. Each of these two ways invokes a traditional understanding of Catholicity as the one most able to meet the contemporary challenges which the Church faces. By invoking Catholicity, we shall see the Church is reaffirming its identity and authenticity and is thereby trying to put its stamp on this particular way and the actions and practices that flow from it. I will also adumbrate that another dimension of Catholicity has been emerging out of the experience of globalization that could be added to the historic too. And then in a brief third part, I will reflect first on how these two ways will construe certain issues we now face and how they justify theologically the paths they purport to undertake. So the first part, Catholicity, a brief history. Catholicity in its general sense means something like comprehensive, all-encompassing, or universal. It finds its theological origins in the early 2nd century. It has received renewed attention within Catholic theology in recent years for two reasons. First of all, there is a growing awareness that for the first time in its history, the Roman Catholic Church really is a worldwide church as a result of the missionary efforts of the 19th and 20th centuries. How to grasp that reality has given the concept new salience. Secondly, Catholicity seems to provide a possible framework for dealing with another all-encompassing phenomenon of our time, namely globalization. In order to use this concept to engage both the phenomena of being a worldwide church and that of globalization, it's important to trace some of the significant lines in the history of that concept. In the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, promulgated in 381, the Church is confessed as being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. That Catholicity made its way into this confession of faith indicates that it was already a known concept. The phrase katholou does appear once in the New Testament in Acts 4:18, but not in reference to the Church. Its theological meaning is usually traced to Ignatius of Antioch, who applies the term to the Church around the year 110. In his letter to the church at Smyrna, he writes, and I quote, "Wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." Scholars believe that he intended by this to emphasize how each concrete community of believers gathered around its bishop in the celebration of the Eucharist, both as a concrete instance of and participates in the universal community of the Church. This fullness of the universal community derives from the universal salvation Christ has brought into the world. This fullness of grace and truth is as a gift of Christ to the Church. It is now mediated to the world through the Church. Universality or Catholicity in this earliest sense meant, therefore, this fullness of salvation and the fullness of being in Christ. As the early Church expanded, this understanding of universality came to include also the geographical extension of the Church in the communion of communities of faith throughout the then known world, known to those people at that part of the world. Others, of course, obviously knew they were there. By the end of the 3rd century, especially in North Africa, Catholicity required an additional meaning, as is evidenced already in the martyrdom of Polycarp, which dates from around 156, and the polemics of Tertullian and others. Catholicity was what distinguished the true church from what were seen as competing heretical sects. We perhaps have a more complex understanding of church formation now than is often portrayed in these narratives, but let me stick with these older ones. Thus, accepting the fullness of truth given by Christ to the church meant that to be Catholic was also to be accepting of all that had been revealed through Christ. It was to be orthodox. It was in this way that in the Western Church, Catholic came to be a designation of distinctive church bodies, local or particular churches that were in communion with the See of Rome. Here one sees a first instance of Catholic coming to express a distinctive identity, but also one potentially fraught with hegemonic possibilities. These two senses of Catholicity, universality and fullness of truth, are brought together by Cyril of Jerusalem in his Catecheses, and I quote here from Cyril, at the end of the 4th century. The Church is Catholic or universal because of its spread throughout the entire world, from one end of the earth to the other. Again, it is called Catholic because it teaches fully and unfailingly all the doctrines which are brought to our knowledge, whether they are concerned with visible or invisible things, with the realities of heaven or the things of earth. Augustine, in his controversies with the Donatists, helped develop a new discourse of Catholicity, wherein he introduces an additional dimension or perspective on Catholicity, namely, adherence to the legitimate authority that guaranteed the universality and orthodoxy of the Church, the bishops united with the Bishop of Rome. Thus, the elements of universality, orthodoxy, and adherence to authority shaped the theological discourse of Catholicity, at least in its Western usage. In the East, it was somewhat different. Connected in the concrete reality of the Church by temporal continuity. Again, we see the potential for making Catholicity a marker for uniformity and obedience in this development. In the 16th century Reformation, the polemics about the nature of the visible and the invisible Church revived interest in Catholicity and brought forth yet another dimension to its discourse. The Church of Rome emphasized the history of the three elements, universality, orthodoxy, adherence to legitimate authority, as embodied in the visible church governed by the Pope. The Reformers, on the other hand, reached back to Ignatius of Antioch to understand Catholicity as the participation of each Christian community in the eschatological invisible church. These stances continued down into the 20th century. The Second Vatican Council took up at several points the Catholicity of the Church. Without abandoning its sense of Catholicity embodied in the visible church, it held up in a special way Ignatius's vision of Catholicity, especially in its understanding of the relationship of the particular or local church to the universal church. How the fullness of the church is present in each particular church, yet only inasmuch as those churches are united to all other particular churches, and the Church of Rome is bound up with Catholicity. Catholicity is not a possession of the church, but is rather Christ's gift to the church and must be cherished and honored as such. The understanding of how this plurality and unity come together in a concept of Catholicity was expressed by the concept of communio, or communion, set forth in the Extraordinary Synod of Bishops in 1985. Intended to convey the rich meanings of the New Testament concept of koinonia, communio is an expression of the love that binds together and defines the relations of the persons of the Trinity and is revealed in Christ's love for the church. This communion is lived out by believers in the internal communion with one another and with their bishop, and in the particular or local churches with the universal church and the See of Rome. To be sure, communion has come to encompass a whole range of meanings, in fact, even more meanings than the meaning of Catholicity itself. In reflecting on what such an understanding of Catholicity means in an age of globalization, I've suggested elsewhere that a third dimension, or perhaps an operational definition of what communio actually entails, of Catholicity needs to be held up, namely that of communication. Communication that is grounded in the love and mutuality of the persons of the Trinity, and one that is keenly aware also of how communication can misfire in cross-cultural situations, seems necessary if Catholicity is to be a lived reality in the contemporary world church in all its contextual, doctrinal, and structural realities. Which brings me then to my second part, two discourses of Catholicity in the church today. It is possible to discern two discourses of Catholicity today abroad within the church. Both of these forms of Catholicity draw upon traditional understandings of the concept as universality, as fullness of truth, as visible communion, albeit in different ways and with different emphases. In so doing, they present distinctive discourses within which the self-understanding of the church is articulated. What makes them significant for our investigation here is not so much the direct debate over the concept itself, but rather how they envision the relationship of the church to the world. To understand the differences between the two, one must be aware of two factors that have been shaping the debate between them about the church's relationship to the world. One is external, and the other internal. The external factor has to do with how one views the world itself, vis-a-vis God, salvation history, and the church's role within that. It asks questions like, where and how is God revealed in the world today? Just how is to one judge the goodness of the world in light of its fallenness? How are we to assess the human condition in light of these realities? How does the salvation offered by God in Christ manifest itself and effect a renewed communion with God? And what is the role of the church in all of this? So that's the external factor. How do we relate to the world? The internal factor, that is within the church, that is shaping the debate between the forms of Catholicity has to do with how to interpret the Second Vatican Council, held in the middle of the 20th century, and how its role in the longer history of the church. As a council of renewal, is its vision and the implementation of its vision one that is marked by a radical turn toward the world after 2 centuries of a self-imposed distancing from modernity? Is it therefore marked by a rupture with the immediate past, so as to achieve a more complex and holistic vision that will better engage the complexities of the contemporary world? Or is the renewal but a moment of adjustment within the internal life and disposition of the church so that it might better manifest the truth of Christ to the world, to be a more authentic sacramentum mundi, or sacrament of the world? This internal debate, which has been strongest in Europe, the United States, and Australia, not only posits 2 different understandings of the meaning of the council, but also 2 different ways that the church should see itself and its role in the larger world. These 2 factors are examples, I believe, of contextual forces that call for a response and in turn summon forth a new reflection about the meanings of Catholicity. So let us turn now to 2 discourses of Catholicity that aim to situate the church in its efforts to address the contemporary world, especially the manifold dimensions of globalization. The first approach focuses upon Catholicity as the extension of the church throughout the entire world, with extension being seen both theologically and geographically. That geographical extension, already evident in the cultural diversity of the bishops who assembled for the Second Vatican Council 50 years ago, now for the first time makes the church a genuinely world church. But this geographical reality has a theological significance as well. The church, as the bearer of the good news of Jesus Christ, is the agent of the Missio Dei, the task and purposes of the Trinitarian God in the world. That mission entails bringing the gospel message of healing, of liberation, of redemption, and reconciliation to every creature. To do this, the church focuses not so much on itself, but rather in imitation of its self-emptying Lord, a reference here, of course, to Philippians 2, on the world that it is trying to engage. It does so by sharing deeply the world's joys and hopes, its sufferings and fears, as was stated so eloquently in the opening words of the pastoral constitution Gaudium et Spes, the constitution on the church in the modern world at the council. The church exists for the sake of this mission of bringing all people and all things together in Christ. In order to carry out this mission, it must read the signs of the times. And this is done by seeking out the ways that God is already at work in the world before the church even arrives, planting what were called the semina verbi, or seeds of the word. This goes back to Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, in the goodness of creation. The world is indeed marked by sin, but more importantly is suffused with God's grace. These semina verbi, seeds of the word, are to be identified and nurtured, and those things that stand in the way of their flourishing are to be resisted and overcome. One can see how the substance and tenor of Gaudium et Spes set the tone for the church's living up in faithfulness to this gift of Catholicity. What that means in practice is always trying to discern the signs of the times, those places where God, in going before us, has indicated that the gospel should be presented and the reign of God needs to be realized. This is carried out concretely in solidarity with those who are poor and oppressed, in practices of dialogue to discern those signs and to demonstrate solidarity, and in culturation to provide environments for the flourishing of these semina verbi. These three practices, solidarity, dialogue, and enculturation, shape the grammar of this discourse on Catholicity. Solidarity, dialogue, enculturation. These are three key ways that Catholicity is exercised in a global world. Solidarity is especially needed with those who are excluded from the benefits of globalization or simply left behind. This is the solidarity to which John Paul II appealed in his Discourses on globalization. He said repeatedly that the key thing in globalization is a globalization of solidarity. So there are no excluded. There are no people left on the far shore of poverty, of disease, and of conflict. Dialogue is Catholicity as communication. It acknowledges and respects difference, but also proceeds from the assumption that our common bonds of human dignity make speaking and acting together possible, despite all our differences. Enculturation recognizes the presence of those seeds of the word that we encounter and provides the social space where those seeds can germinate and grow, be pruned perhaps as needed, and allowed to flourish within the pleroma or the fullness of God's plan for the world. The second approach to Catholicity focuses upon the gift of the fullness of faith as the venue for the understanding of faith. This fullness of faith is the revelation given to us by God in Christ, a treasure entrusted to the church, and which is protected and transmitted through the visible teaching authority of the church. The church is therefore the depository and guarantor of the full and living faith that Christ has imparted to it. It is the regula fidei to which the church conforms itself, the rule of faith, and from it draws its identity and purpose. On this view, the world was created good by God, but is sinful and fallen in such a way that it can never hope to rescue itself. Indeed, it at times cannot even recognize the truth in which it was created and by which it must live. The church engages this world by juxtaposing itself over against that world, offering the world as an alternative view of itself in light of the truth that Christ has entrusted to the church. The church is the bearer of light and truth for a sinful and fallen world. One thinks here of the image of the church offered at the beginning of another document of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, light of the nations. The church offers the world not only God's revelation, but also the revelation of the true nature of the world itself. The world's hope is to listen to the church and so enter into the realm of the divine, the graced, and the transcendent, which is the church. Here the models of the earthly and heavenly cities, presented in Augustine's great work, The City of God, provide the framework for understanding the world's destiny. The City of God, you may recall, the focal impetus for that great work of Augustine was the sack of Rome in the year 410. Adherents of the old Roman religion blamed Christianity for weakening the empire and the dreadful experience of Rome being conquered. Augustine responded with a polemic contra paganos by juxtaposing the earthly city, which found its source of strength in the old Roman religion, and the city of God, at whose heart lay the Catholic Church. When one approaches the city of God as a part of a larger genre, it can be deemed as a literature of crisis. Crisis, I would suggest, is key to understanding this second. Theological literature of crisis is to protect the integrity of the faith and to ensure a vigorous identity by practices that enhance that identity. It is that shared identity that guarantees the unity and thereby the integrity of the Church's witness to the fullness of Christ and his message. The liturgy plays a central role here as a practice that creates identity and proper focus upon God. Mission is not so much about going out into the world and befriending it, as it is inviting the world into the Church and its doxological practices. There the world will find its true meaning. Mission is best understood in the parable of the great feast in Luke 14, where all are invited in to be part of the feast. And indeed, this did serve as the motivation for mission in the Western Church from the time of Augustine into the late 16th century. Because of the influence of evangelical Protestantism, we think that the motivation for mission was always the Great Commission of Matthew 28. That really only starts to appear in the literature in the late 16th century. Justinian Welz, a Lutheran theologian, as far as we can tell, was the first to bring that forward. The practices of this mission, of the second discourse, involve manifesting to the world the beauty and the truth of God's revealing and redeeming acts, concretely presented in the visible church, and urging individual persons to turn away from the sinfulness of the world and to conform themselves in ever greater holiness to the Lord and his church. Sinfulness and evil are so pervasive within the world that changing the world's social structures will not lead to overcoming that sinfulness. Such utopian schemes confuse our power with the power of God. Only personal conversion and growth in holiness will make the difference. This approach, too, reads the signs of the times, but in a different way. Perhaps more a reading of the signs of being between the times, evocative of the journal of that name, published by Protestant theologians in Germany in the 1920s. It is also closer to what may be the original meaning of the concept signs of the times in the Gospels, where signs of the times and the signs were apocalyptic ones, evidence of God's breaking into the sinful world with judgment and redemption. They bespeak a theology of history that sees the consummation of the world only possible through a radical cleansing and purgation that can lead to a redeemed state. Signs of the times on this reading, therefore, make us watchful and ready for God's breaking into our world. If the first approach is shaped by practices of solidarity, dialogue, and enculturation to foster Catholicity, the second approach might find as its key practices contemplation of beauty, dwelling in the truth, and a celebration of the liturgy that focuses in its beauty on the transcendence of God as the way to the fullness of Catholicity. But one sees here the specter of empire stalking this vision, a vision that is deeply critical of the world, but largely eschews similar critique of the Church itself. As one might surmise, those who identify themselves with the understanding of the Second Vatican Council as making a radical turn to the world and engaging in a significant rupture with the 2 centuries immediately preceding the Council would favor the first approach to Catholicity, that of extension and engagement with the world. Those who seek greater continuity with the past in the Church's documents would find a more likely domicile in the second approach, that of juxtaposing the church to the world. The first approach is more optimistic about the current state of the world. Despite the suffering and oppression that is so manifestly evident, God is overcoming that in God's own ways and through the ministry of the church. The second approach takes a darker look and sees the world's redemption coming about less by human effort and more by the strong intervention on God's part. Bridging the two approaches, if they can be bridged, to Catholicity is a theology and spirituality of communion, a concept important to both approaches. However, the two approaches enter the realm of communion by different doors. Those more close to the first approach begin with the plurality of cultures and the place of the local church within them, and then move toward a sense of unity. Those more close to the second approach begin with the unity in Christ embodied in the universal church, and particularly the Pope, and then proceed to the particular church and to plurality. In taking their respective approaches, one sees the advantages and disadvantages of each. The first appears to honor difference and otherness much more clearly by beginning with plurality, and then emphasizing solidarity, dialogue, and enculturation. But it is often not clear what unity might mean if all that diversity is preserved as integral to the discussion. In other words, criteria for normativity and truth can seem to be lacking. There is a danger that solidarity becomes such a profound identification with the world that no critical distance is maintained. The second approach clearly secures unity and normativity, but it is often difficult to tell whether diversity and plurality are really being taken seriously. Dialogue does not have an intrinsic value, since the truth is already given. The approach's inward-looking character can give its self-understanding a totalizing character, as though there were nothing worthwhile to seek beyond the church. This can lead to the hubris of the 0 point, as decolonial thinker Santiago Castro Gomez has put it. The 0 point, this is the illusion that one can inhabit a position of absolute objectivity that allows for unquestioned reading of the world. So one can see traces of imperial thinking here. This brings me to my third and final part. The two discourses of Catholicity and the challenges of the contemporary world. In this third section, I turn to how these discourses of Catholicity within Roman Catholicism affect living and acting in a globalized world. Then I'll try to relate the two approaches to just a couple of select questions that confront our world today to give some sense of how this can be a heuristic tool. And in closing, I offer a few words on the role of communication in Catholicity. The first approach, as we've seen, attends to the plurality to be found in the world and tries to meet that plurality as much as possible on its own terms. It is grounded in a vision of creation and grace that seeks out God's presence of the world and engages in practices that serve to discipline and focus that vision, dialogue, for example, so as to foster bonds of solidarity with all persons of goodwill. It is only in this way that we might achieve the unity of all creation that God intends, and God will complete in the final reconciliation of all things in Christ. The second approach is less optimistic about the world it encounters. It sees the world in a time of crisis. It calls the church to foster a strong identity for the sake of unity and a proclamation of the truth of Christ amid contending claims and ideologies. It represents the world as the church as an alternative to the world. It is in the church that the divine and the divine intention may be experienced. Sin so besets the world that there is little to be learned from the world in its unredeemed state. Rather, the truth and light of Christ is to be presented and proclaimed, especially through the liturgy. The world is invited to enter the church and experience the beauty of the form that the world is given and is recast in grace. Now to turn to just a couple of questions that impinge especially on the Catholic Church as a global institution. First issue is that of identities. Globalization, with its multiple social forces that connect and dislocate, that expand and compress, that homogenize and highlight difference all at the same time, have profound effects and impacts on identities. The forces are such that some seek to escape this maelstrom by clinging to a single representation of themselves, be it with an ethnic group, with a form within religion, or with a sense of victimhood. Amartya Sen has warned us eloquently of the consequences of seeking such single identities and the trajectories that they often portend toward violence. How do the two discourses of Catholicity help and hinder the quest for identities in the contemporary world? The first approach allows a great deal of play for difference and the expression of different identities. Its emphasis on solidarity and dialogue provides some ground rules for the encounter of different identities. This can work well, providing this encounter is happening in a stable environment where safety is secured. It can easily allow for the development of a kind of soft pluralism where multiple identities can be viewed as non-threatening. But if there is no underlying political or social stability, pluralism of identities becomes very difficult to achieve or to maintain. I make this point particularly for us as academics because there's a lot of talk about difference as well there should be. But to have a calm discourse where identities can come forward and not be assaulted in some kind of way presumes an underlying social stability. I have ended up working in parts of the world where that's not the case. And the problem is that identities become so rigid, there's no place for any difference because then you're in the outgroup and you're at risk. So in our discourse, one of the things we have to realize is what does our general environment provide us as a platform for discussing difference and its possibilities. The second approach attends more closely to the forging of workable identities because it presumes crisis. Examples of this within the church today are those young clerics who style themselves John Paul II priests. They project a strong sense of identity as cultic leaders that can attract those who have tired of negotiating multiple identities and seek a clear path. They are very consistent with the larger worldview, the larger view of the world in crisis and the church providing safe haven from it. This view of being Catholic can indeed offer an overarching identity that might transcend other identities, but it can become an imperial one, where internal critique is not tolerated and little flexibility toward local circumstances is allowed. It overcomes plurality largely by sidestepping it, ignoring it, or suppressing it altogether. So how we're going to negotiate identities in a globalized world is one area where I think the discourses of Catholicity illuminate the paths people are taking, but it also, I think, upon reflection, allows us to think about the potential limits of each. A second instance, suffering and the pursuit of justice. Globalization reveals most acutely, thanks to advances in communication, the suffering and injustice that are rife in the world. We no longer read about armed conflict, we see it happening. That we have the images before us that can indeed overwhelm us of suffering. How is the pursuit of justice to be undertaken? The first approach, because of its concern for attending to the local environment, looks especially to the social and cultural context that at once enhances or blocks movement toward justice. The structures of society come under special scrutiny at local, regional, and international levels. Change of these structures will promote greater autonomy of people within those structures. At the same time, the collapse of the lure of the great ideologies for reform at the end of the past century remind us how inadequate both our descriptions for change, of change, and prescriptions for change are. To sweep away an authoritarian government, we now, of course, know, does not guarantee the blossoming of democracy. Democracy is no more a normal form than other governments. It has to be learned. It has to be practiced. The second approach says that justice begins with the transformation of the human heart. Transformed individuals will create a better and more just society, but no better and more just society can come about without the transformation of the human heart. We have learned, however, I hope, that such transformations may be necessary, but they are hardly a sufficient condition for the establishment of greater justice. We cannot ignore the social structures that our fundamentally interdependent existence requires. If you want to see a concrete example of this at work within the Roman Catholic Church, the synod that was held 2 years ago on Africa, the issue of reconciliation was a major issue. And if you look at the speeches that were given by people coming from Africa about this, you will find a mix of these two approaches. The importance of the change of the human heart, corresponding to the second approach, but also the need to address corruption, greed, the ethnification of societies where ethnicity was not the issue before. All of those kinds of things were present in those speeches. The Pope's response to this came out this past November in a document called Africae Munus. And while the first approaches to dealing with corruption and greed are still there, it's the second approach that is overwhelmingly present in that document. The task of the church is to change hearts. So how do we choose between these two approaches? Obviously, they are both ideal types. Real people may favor one or the other, but will likely still incorporate elements from the other one to some degree. The current Pope is clearly in the second approach. He made this very clear in his first speech to the Roman Curia after his election. Although he does acknowledge certain things from the first. If you look at his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, there you see a number of those things present, so much so that it upset some neoconservative Catholics in this country, saying that the Pope had been led astray, by liberal thinking. Well, whatever you think of Pope Benedict, he's not easily led astray. He's one of the best minds we've ever had in the papacy. Some say the greatest since Clement XIV, who, as Pope, maintained a correspondence with Voltaire. Being Catholic, as he has reminded us elsewhere, is working strongly with a both-and rather than an exclusively either-or approach. And it is here that the third approach to Catholicity, stressing the importance of communication, comes into play. I believe that one of the tasks of theologians and other intellectuals in the church, as well as those concerned about what the church does looking in, is to attend to our language and the consequences of our words for action. The commitment to solidarity, dialogue, and enculturation requires a genuine listening to the other. But that listening is never from a zero point. We must acknowledge our location and our interests and not too easily dismiss what we find unacceptable. The language flowing from commitments to truth and beauty, situated in a time of crisis, keeps before us additional perspectives and reminds us that crises need responses. But precisely in a marshaling of our resources, the second approach can veer into a language that is exclusionary and apodictic, yes, even imperial. Serving on behalf of the divine can seduce us into thinking we speak from a divine zero point, as it were. So the tone and content of our communications can serve as a barometer that can warn us when we border on drifting either into too soft language on the one hand or imperial discourse on the other. The Catholic Church, because of its sheer size, its extent, and its history, has to reflect regularly and carefully on its place in the world, even as it attends to the voices within itself. In a time when our world faces so many challenges, politically, economically, socially, and ecologically, it must direct itself to those challenges. Catholicity, I believe, is a theological way of entering those discussions, a way that we hope will be of benefit to humankind, and at the same time, however, avoid some of the tyrannies, usurpations, errors, and superstitions that it can also produce. Thank you.